Honourable Speaker, and I'd like today to talk about the National Measurement Amendment Bill, and I'd certainly like to commend the two former speakers, Minister Lowe and Roxley, on their contributions and the importance of this whole national measurement. The concerns for industry, small business, and generally our total economy is very dependent on having a surety of certain standards. But Mr Deputy Speaker, what I'd probably like to give an understanding through discussion and debate of this bill is probably some of the history that brings us to the point that we are now. And in fact, people quite often take it for granted that our measurements are there, that we quote capacity and length, a whole range of different understandings by measurement. But if you understand the long history in terms of even at this year of 2008, but there are thousands of history of development towards this point where we can say that standards we put in place and confirmed, certainly in this country of Australia, as a federation of states. As we've many times on this side of the House spoken about the notion of cooperative federalism and certainly the issues of red tape reduction, this is certainly a major part of ensuring that we can provide to industry some definite and definitives in terms of measurement. But I'll take you to probably an era of the Greeks and the Romans, and if you understand and look at the history, certainly with the Greeks and the Romans, who were great builders of cities, and certainly the Romans through a whole range of programs and the nature of the way they advanced through many countries, significant remnants and remains of the Roman, what was probably certainly the wars and battles that went on to them taking on these great lands, but essentially their legacy was in the built environment. And if you understand, when we look at some of those ancient ruins, and if people who have travelled through some of those countries, certainly Rome is a very good example in a small area of the input that the Romans have had, certainly in the built environment. But can I say, Mr Deputy Speaker, it actually comes back to an understanding of measurement and the standards that were established many thousands of years ago. In fact, quite today, in this chamber, in fact, the symmetry of the way that this chamber is built is very much based on an understanding of those early measurements. And for many people, when they pick up a piece of paper, for instance, and they look at the symmetry of that piece of paper and the fact that most pieces of paper are rectangular in shape, well, there's actually no accident for that, Mr Deputy Speaker. This comes back to some determination many thousands of years ago about what the perfect rectangle might be. And if we can imagine that this decision wasn't made some thousands of years ago, that we might be actually writing on square pieces of paper. In fact, the symmetry may be quite different. And again, the notion of construction, if you look at building of a house or a large facade, and certainly some of those ancient Roman buildings, and essentially what I'm alluding to, that were not just put together based on the available material or the masonry that they had available to them, but it had some significance in terms of the symmetry and the way that they were built. And that was highly dependent on a standard of measurement. And I said that the so-called perfect rectangle, or otherwise known as the golden rectangle, if you look at any rectangular shape, or one that is most pleasing to the eye, it's actually based on ratios. So it's taking the square measure and then applying a ratio of 1:1.2. And again, looking at a humble sheet of paper, that essentially is representative of that golden rectangle. And if you look at the ancient Greek and the Roman buildings, you will immediately see what I'm suggesting when you look at the way that they designed those. That comes down to the proscenium arches that we have in our theatres. Something to do even with the way that we've determined that we need to watch TV on the flat screens that are now developed. All has a bearing on some very, very basic measurement. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, the reason I'm raising this is certainly to point towards the significance of this bill and the need to standardise our measurements, the subtleties that exist in terms of this understanding, yet has huge ramifications. And as I mentioned earlier, that we could well be writing on square pieces of paper rather than rectangular pieces had there not been some decisions made about standardisation. And I probably can give better demonstration of that if we look at the introduction, certainly into my state of Queensland back in 1974, the metric system. Now, of course, the metric system goes back a long, long time. In fact, there's been variations of it and in different languages explain the notion of the base of 10. The square roots, in fact, and a whole range of tables that were developed probably 500 or 600 years ago, all were based on the notion of the decimal or the point of 10. And if you look at, I think as far back as 1586, the interesting thing is that the English, in consideration with the French, and certainly with the new or the emerging Americas through the War of Independence, had a large role to play in determination of weights, measures, and those very things that I'm talking about. The irony, of course, is that still today the US has major confusion over the way that they deal with their weights and measures. And in fact, many people on a daily basis, not so much anymore, Mr Deputy Speaker, because the introduction of the metric system into this country certainly helped a lot of that. But can I say, if anyone's ever been confronted with the notion of using Phil's cap or Quarto paper against an A4, dare I say an A3 sheet, they all have relevance in terms of the need for standardisation. Not so much anymore, but only a few years ago that you could quite easily slip into the notion of, or be accidentally purchasing a writing pad that might not actually fit a certain folder or fit in a particular printer, and simply because the standards of measurement weren't determined very well, and in fact the US having a major part of developing as an early industrial nation the whole notion of print, and these ratios and measurements were somewhat ad hoc. But I said the irony is, of course, that decimal currency entered the US just after the time of the American independence, simply because there was a need to have a standardisation of their currency and the introduction of paper currency. And yet, I think even at that stage, it was probably too difficult for the Americas to introduce the notion of a metric system or a standardisation of a system of measurement. In fact, as I said, back in 1974 in the state of Queensland, it was certainly a mandate and a dictate. I was at that stage in grade 9. I'd spent all my earlier years having the notions of feet and inches and yards and fathoms and a whole range of what we call imperial measurements, very much, I won't say belted into us because that's essentially not what happened, but the notion that we felt under a lot of pressure to be able to roll off those tables of measurement. That's right, remember for Rankin, the 1,760 yards in a mile, 5,280 feet, and it goes on and on. That's right, and that had relevance to the cricket pitch. So the member for Rankin certainly understands where I'm coming from. The reality, of course, is that those measurements didn't work together. And I should give an understanding of why we adopted them, certainly under the British system, even with those earlier influences of the British with the French, certainly King Louis XV, and as part of that move for the War of Independence, there was a whole range of standards. Measurement became very much a part of the deliberations about war and about a whole range of standards, and I can probably suggest that politically there are reasons why the Americas, once they gained independence, took on decimal currency, but decided the overall decimal system wasn't going to suit. But talking about imperial, in fact, the terminology itself has some bearing on the whole notion of the system. I mean, the imperial certainly brings up the notion of royalty. And of course, this is probably well depicted in the Vitruvian Man that Leonardo da Vinci draws, and many people will know that figure that has the symmetry of the human body. It actually has a major role to play in the notion of measurements. And the imperial system, as I said, was very much the introduction of a system, usually by the principality, by the leader at the time, certainly the royal family, if it was a monarchy. And of course, the notion of imperial, we then look at the Vitruvian Man, which explains the fact that a foot had a particular measure. It was actually the size of the ruler's foot. So that was fine if there was an average, and it was certainly a dynasty of leaders who may have had similar features, but you can immediately see if there was a child king, the whole system of measurement would be turned on its head. And so we talk about the foot. The Vitruvian Man is a way of looking at the standard of foot, but it was clear that having a system that would change every time a ruler changed would be a concern. And I should say the whole term ruler, we understand at school when we had 12 inches, which is also a measurement that's related to the thumb, that 12 inches would make a foot. And of course, that was on a ruler, denoting, of course, the ruler at the time, or the king, or the leader. So it was very much based in some sort of ad hoc approach to measurement. So the standards certainly were established. The Romans had their own system of measurement, but it was very much based on ratios. And of course, the development of the decimal system is probably, for this country, was a major step forward. Decimal currency in 1966 followed within 8 years, generally with the introduction of the metric system. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I remember asking a group of young people many years ago about the metre, and did they understand where the metre actually came from. It was an established measurement, and over time there has been changes to the way that's determined, but essentially, Mr. Deputy Speaker, it was decided in the mid-1700s that there should be a way of establishing standards, something that won't change. And of course, we understand that without the way that we keep measurement today, usually in a beam of light or through some atomic measurement of certainly weights, lengths, volume, etc. But can I say, back in the mid-1700s, where astronomy was a major step forward in terms of an understanding what was certainly part of a global community and not the flat earth theories that existed before those early explorers. But the notion of the metre, very cleverly measured, and in fact, if anyone in the House knows where the metre actually comes from, and the member for Rankin, it's question and answer. The member for Rankin, do you know where through the chair, sorry,
through the chair,
Mr. Deputy Speaker,
where remarks should be directed, and the Minister, I think, does not need to assist the Honourable.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, for your indulgence, but I'll tell you where it comes from. It's actually 1/10,000,000th of the distance between the North Pole and the equator, and so that was a standard that was established at that particular time, and that has changed, can I say, because there's probably more reliable ways of standardising that. But if you've ever wondered where we came up with this notion of the metre, very closely related to the yard, of course, 3 feet, and that goes back to the Vitruvian man. And that's right, 39.37 inches in a metre, in fact. But the reality of establishing a standard that was based on the notion of 10 meant that you could divide and cut up that metric standard of the metre, and I'll use the linear measurement as a start because there are volumes and mass that come into that. But if you look at the metre and its divisibility by 10 is a very, very important part of what that establishment of the metre was about. And of course, if I relate back to my earlier statements about industry, the development of the printing industry, certainly Gutenberg didn't have a lot to do with the notion of paper size. He essentially cobbled together whatever he could in terms of rag and others to print. But certainly with the Industrial Revolution, with the Americas moving ahead, particularly what became the United States, they very much were the ones who developed and created what we understand is the printing industry today. And the standard of paper became very much something that people needed to work very closely with. And all of us who've read newspapers in the days when we'd sit on the train or have large newspapers that we'd have to fold and twist, can I say the development of the metric system allowed the introduction of the tabloid. So the tabloid is essentially an A3 sheet of paper, even though there are variations of it now called tabloids, and usually the tabloid is something smaller than the old large post newspapers that we had. But the difficulty, of course, for industry, and particularly this country, when we established the metric system, is that we had this inconsistency between the US and ourselves. And we'd always had that inconsistency, even when talking about the imperial system in this country, the pint, the gallon. I mean, there was always a US gallon that happened to be a lesser amount than the Australian gallon. Those consistencies, to some degree, have moved on because of our adoption of the metric system, and other countries now, as an international in a trading arrangement, talk in terms of metric. But can I say, in industries like the printing industry, certainly in the metal industry, where measurements were still in the old imperial feet, inches, square measures were certainly worked in that way. Can I say the establishment of the metric system, and I'll use that example of the printing industry because it comes down to the notion of a sheet of paper. I talked about the golden rectangle and why we actually have rectangular sheets of paper, because it is the perfect rectangle. If people understand the notion of an A3 sheet, an A4 sheet, I have an A4 sheet here in front of me, that this all is based on the standard of the square metre. So the large sheet of paper, that you start with a calculation of an A0. An A0 sheet is 1 square metre of paper. 1 square metre, but in the golden rectangle is 1.1.2, the ratio that it's from that standard of the A0